Well, you did it. This is better than I thought it was going to be honest. Thanks for braving the weather and the roads. And if you're joining us at home, we're happy to have you as well. For me, this happens with all sorts of kids. Have you ever been around a kid and watched them get in trouble? And the first thing that happens, as soon as a kid gets in trouble, whoever it is that's disciplined them or whatever, they'll look at that adult or teacher or whoever, and they go, "What'd I do?" As if like they have no clue what they just, like this just happened in our house this past week. One of our kids got in trouble and immediately they're like, "What did I do?" I was like, "Are you serious? Like you don't have like any memory problems. This just happened 30 seconds ago. What are you talking about? You don't know what you did to get yourself in trouble." Right? Like normally like we do stuff on purpose and then we get in trouble, right? This happened to me all the time in school. Listen, I'll make a long story short. When I was in 10th grade, listen, if you're still in school, I'm telling you a story, not about what you should do, just what I did, okay? I got permanently kicked out of my 10th grade honors English class. Me and this lady had multiple run-ins, but one of the things that happened that led to me being permanently kicked out of my honors English class was we had a little mishap with a cell phone in her class because she was a teacher that didn't have a clock on the wall. She didn't want us to know how much longer we had to endure her, which I thought was unfair. So one day I pull my phone out, I look at it, I put it away. That's all that I did. To this day, I will stand on that. She told me I was playing cell phone games for the whole duration of the class and took my phone and said I could get it back from the principal at the end of the day. When that class was over, I walked up to her desk, grabbed that phone and just going to walk off. She said, "Excuse me, you'll have to leave that here and get it back at the end of the day." And I looked at her. I wasn't going to be shocked as to why I got in trouble. I did this on purpose. I looked at her and I said, "Listen, if I leave that cell phone here, I'm going downstairs. And I will call the Nitro Police Department and tell them that you stole my cell phone." There was no question as to what I did to land myself in trouble. It wasn't like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't go home and go, 'Mom, I don't know what happened.'" I knew. So I've been pondering this question this past week. Obviously, Jesus found himself in a bit of trouble in his life, given the fact that, they ultimately killed him. Isn't that funny? Last week we talked, what was the main message of Jesus of Nazareth, and most people believe that it's love. If that was his main message, how did it end up in death? Anybody ever consider that? If his main message was love and forgiveness and all the nonsense, it's not nonsense, but you know what I'm saying. If that's all ancillary to it. It's all part of it, but it's not the main thing. But if that was the main thing, wouldn't it be weird that the story ends in death? Yeah, it is weird that it ends that way, because that's not like, so I want to ask the question today, what was it that made him so offensive to the point that they wanted to arrest him and kill him? What led to that? What did he do? And I think, honestly, there could be a whole list of these things, right? There could be all kinds of ways that he upset the people enough to where he eventually gets killed. But there's one thing I believe that stands above the other. We've talked about it many, many times over the years here at Southridge, so we have to visit it again because it's our next step in building the foundation for our kingdom series. It's our next step. So the question we're looking at today, what was this thing that he did? Like, I knew what I did. I knew as soon as that came out of my mouth, that was going to be a problem. Not just with the teacher or with the principal. I knew when I got home that was going to be a problem. I knew what I did. Did Jesus know what he did? He absolutely did. And I'll tell you this, he did it on purpose. He did it on purpose. If you have your Bible, go with me to Luke chapter 19, or you can hit the QR code in front of you and follow along with my digital notes. I'm going to try to get us through the whole chapter of Luke 19. I probably won't read every verse, but I want to look at all of it, because here's how I want you to start to learn to read the Bible. Because remember last week I said, you can't just pop into a passage, find out the thing that that's good for my life, take that, and then take off of the rest of it. The way that especially the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the way that they're arranged not just chronologically. Some of them, like Luke, is more chronological than the others, but they are arranged. The stories that are being told in the ways that they are shown up, they are being arranged theologically. So they're arranged in a way to make sure that you get the underlying message, not just of the individual story, but of the story as a whole. That's what I want to show you how to do today through Luke 19. How you can find the one thing that the whole thing is about and carry it through every single passage in a given chapter. In fact, if you went before this to chapter 18, you go ahead of this to chapter 20, I could do the exact same thing and show you that Luke is weaving together one major point about Jesus. And it is the reason why he landed himself in so much trouble. Luke chapter 19 begins with a story about a man named Zacchaeus. Maybe you've heard the story of Zacchaeus, maybe not. Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector, which meant he oversaw all the other traders. See, the tax collectors were so bad. When the other gospel writers mention the tax collectors, they say there was disreputable people like sinners and tax collectors. Like they got their own category. They didn't even get to be part of the regular sinners. They were all over here by themselves because they were seen as that heinous. Because what they did was, these were Jewish citizens that had teamed up with Rome to tax the Jewish people above and beyond what they were required to tax them, and they got very wealthy off of it. And Zacchaeus ends up being the worst of the worst because he's the chief, so that means that he oversees all the traders. He oversees all sorts of traders, and so he himself has gotten very, very wealthy off the back of his own people. And so this is not a guy that anybody really wants anything to do, but Zacchaeus, it tells us, knew that Jesus was coming to town, to his town of Jericho. Now, if you're familiar with the song that we sang growing up, we find out in the text that Zacchaeus was a short guy, which I don't know why that has to make a difference in the story. To be honest, why we always have to pick on people that have height issues. I think there's some places in the world I'd be a giant. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but I'm hoping that it is. But Zacchaeus was a tiny guy. He wanted to see Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd, so it tells us that he climbed up in a tree because he wanted to see Jesus. Isn't that wild? This chief tax collector, this person that's made a living cheating other people, robbing from his own people, he too wants to see Jesus. And as Jesus comes by and he wants to see Jesus, this would have blown his mind. He thought he was there to see Jesus. He had no clue that Jesus was there to see him. And he looks up in that tree. He says, Zacchaeus, come on down. I need to go to your house today. Could you imagine everybody standing around, all these people, they go, whoa, wait a second, Jesus. Let's talk real quick. You don't want to go to his house. You must not know what he does for a living. He robbed from my grandma just a couple weeks ago. You don't want to go to his house. He's not the right type of, Jesus, like you come, you brought this message of the kingdom, but he doesn't fit into that because he's a bad guy. He preys on the weak. He shouldn't be allowed in. Jesus says this in verse 9. He says, because Zacchaeus has this moment where he goes, you know what, I've been wrong. So he repents and he goes, I'm going to go and pay back 4 times of everything that I've stolen from people. So there's this moment of repentance and where he wants to make restitution. And Jesus says this in verse 9. He says, salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. Now, if you went to ask the religious leaders of the day, is someone like Zacchaeus, could we consider him? He turned his back on the sons of Abraham, on the Jewish people. He turned his back on them, robbed from them, stole from them. How could he be on the inside of this thing that Jesus is doing? If Jesus' message was all about a kingdom, Zacchaeus should have not been allowed in, is what they would have told you. And yet Jesus says in verse 9, he says, salvation, rescue, freedom has come to this house today. For this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. And the question would have to be, who in their right mind, who gets to decide who's in and out of this kingdom? And why does someone like Zacchaeus make it in? When all the religious leaders seem to be at odds with Jesus. They seem to be on the outside looking in, and he's going to say someone like Zacchaeus gets in. We find out like really quickly, like this kingdom that Jesus came talking about is not going to be like the kingdoms of this world. It's not going to be a kingdom that's about power and prestige of its members, that only the wealthy and the mighty and the high society get in. In fact, we're going to find out that this is going to be a massively different type of kingdom, led by a massively different kind of king. But who is it that gets to make those decisions of who's in and who's out of this kingdom? We get a hint at what's going on in verse 10. In verse 10, Jesus makes the comment, right after he says, this man's a true son of Abraham, he says, for the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. The Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. Who is it that has the ability and the power to say who's in or who's out? And Jesus' response is, it's the Son of Man. Now, this is a phrase that always gets so misunderstood. If you've been here for a couple years, you probably already know what's coming. You know where this phrase is from. We've talked about this, but if you're new, let me catch you up. When you see the word Son of Man, that's Jesus' number one title that he wants to use for himself. When Jesus talks about himself, he talks about himself as the Son of Man. Why? And what I would have told you 10 years ago, and what still a lot of people would tell you is, because he was his mother Mary was a human, and so this Son of Man shows us that he was partly human. No. The title Son of Man has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus' mother being human. Son of Man is a prophetic title that comes from Daniel chapter 7. And when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he is telling everyone that is listening that Daniel chapter 7 is all about me. Here's Daniel chapter 7. It says, as my vision continued that night, I saw someone like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient One and was led into his presence. He was given authority. He was given honor and sovereignty over all the nations of the world so that the people of every race and nation and language would obey him. His rule would be eternal, it would never end, and his kingdom will never be destroyed. Jesus says, I get to choose who's in and who's out because I am the king of this kingdom. And the religious leaders do not get to choose who's in and who's out. Society doesn't get to choose. Societal norms don't get to choose. It's not a luck of the draw. Jesus, as the master of the kingdom, chooses who's in and who's out. And if he wants to welcome in the outsider and the one that everyone else turned their back on because he turned their back on everybody else, he is well within his rights, because what he's doing is he is taking those that are far from God, forgiving them of their sins. Salvation has come to this home today, and this man will never be the same. And that's what he's doing. See, deciding on who's in or out, everyone around would have been like, no, you don't know what he did. And Jesus is looking and going, I can forgive what he did. You don't know what he's going to do. And that can be true of you also. So it's very clear in the story of Zacchaeus, the story that's being told is that Jesus is the king. Jesus is the king of the kingdom. The next story in Luke 19 goes on. Jesus is going to tell a story now to follow up this message that Jesus is the king who decides who's in and out. Luke 19 says this, the crowd was listening to everything Jesus said, and because he was nearing Jerusalem, he told them a story to correct the impression that the kingdom of God would begin right away. I prefer the New International Version's version of that because it says he wanted to correct the idea that the kingdom of God would come all at once. Meaning, he's about to tell this story because this following that he is collecting thinks that he's on his way to Jerusalem to have a showdown with Rome, to overthrow the Roman oppressive government and institute his kingdom right then and there. And Jesus is going, I'm going to tell you a story to make sure that you understand that's not what's going on. I'm not headed to Jerusalem to start a war against Rome. I'm going to Jerusalem to wage war, but it's not going to be against Rome. It's not going to be the sort of kingdom, and I'm not going to be the sort of king that you thought I was going to be. So he tells this story. Verse 12 says this, a nobleman was called away to a distant empire to be crowned king and then return. Before he left, he called together 10 of his servants and divided them among them 10 pounds of silver, saying, "Invest this for me while I am gone." But his people hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, "We do not want him as our king." Now, you may be familiar with this story or this a version of this story. And I'll tell you, the reason why we missed the main message is because, remember last week we said most people, what they do, they go to the Bible, they read a story, and they try to find the most immediate thing that applies to their life. And it's like, okay, that's one way to read the Bible, but again, you will end up missing the overarching story and message of the Bible if you do that. And so what most people have done with this is, if you know the rest of the story, the king goes away, he comes back, he calls the 3 servants in. The first servant goes, "Here's what I've done with your money. I doubled it." The second guy comes in, "Oh, I've doubled your money." The third guy comes in and goes, "I did nothing with what you gave me." And then here's what pastors do this all the time. When we're reading this in our devos, we go, "Oh, this is such a good life lesson. Here's what I'm supposed to learn from this, is that I need to do a good job with whatever God's given me." You go, do you really need a verse for that? Do you really need a verse to say that you should take care of the things God gave you? Or could it be that there's actually a much deeper meaning in this passage? Remember what it said. He said there was a nobleman who was called from a far distant kingdom to come to another kingdom to be made king. But the place that he came, the people did not want him to be their king. And he pronounces judgment on the third person that did not steward what had been given to them well, pronounces judgment on them. What's the moral of the story? Is it that you need to take care of the things that God has given you? Absolutely not. The moral of the story is that Jesus is that king, and Israel is that third servant that has squandered what God has gifted them, that God has entrusted them with, and because of that, judgment is coming. I think that sometimes we prefer the message of like, we need to make the most of the gifts and the talents that God has given us, because it's such a nicer message than judgment's coming. But here's the question. What's the role, or who's the person in a kingdom that gets to declare that judgment is coming? It's the king. See, when Jesus tells this story and puts himself in the place of the king, he is once again telling all of Israel and the religious leaders, "I am the rightful king of Israel." Over and over, we see it in Zacchaeus, we see it in this. There's the next passage. Next passage, we normally preach this the week before Easter. It's called the triumphant entry. Jesus tells a couple of his followers to go into the town, to bring back a donkey that's never been ridden before. This is probably an arrangement that Jesus has already made with this man. So his followers go, they get the donkey, they bring it back. Jesus sits on the donkey, and as he begins to ride down the Mount of Olives, and he's headed towards the city of Jerusalem and ultimately into the temple, the people begin to shout praises from Psalm 118, which was a psalm about how when God conquers his enemies, his kingdom will come and there will be a king. And they're singing this song, they're singing it to Jesus, and they're putting their cloaks down on the ground, which is what they would do in the ancient world. When a king was coming to town, they would take their garments off, they would throw them on the road, and they would take palm branches or whatever they could find, and they would wave it, and they would hail this king, and Jesus was totally fine with them doing that, because he was making a pretty clear statement on Palm Sunday. He was making the statement, "I am the king." Zechariah 9:9, he's intentionally fulfilling the prophecy. It says this, "Rejoice, O people of Zion, shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey," riding on a donkey's colt. Jesus is being very intentional when he does this. There are certain prophecies. Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled over 300 prophecies from the Old Testament in his life, death, and resurrection. Over 300. It's remarkable how much he did in that regards. Some of these are what would be called intentionally fulfilled prophecies, meaning Jesus did something on purpose, like getting on that donkey to ride in to fulfill that prophecy. He did that intentionally. Some of these were done unintentionally, meaning that they were out of his control in a sense. Meaning like when Jesus, when it was time for him to die, the fact that he was killed via crucifixion, that's not really up to him, right? That was more up to the people that were in charge. But that was what was prophesied about him, that his hands and his feet would be pierced. The fact that none of his bones were ever broken was prophesied about him, but that's kind of out of his hands. So that would be an unintentional prophecy that was true in his life. But Palm Sunday, this was an intentional prophecy. That he goes, I'm sitting on this donkey, and I will accept your cries that I am your king, because that is who I am. When he makes his way into Jerusalem. He makes it very clear that's who he is. In fact, as he continues down the road and they're shouting Hosanna and hailing him as the king, and they're doing this on Sunday because they think Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem to confront the political powers that be. The overthrow, the revolution is getting ready to begin. The armies of Israel are going to rise up and we're going to take out Rome once and for all. That's why they hail him as king on Sunday, but when they realize that he is a different sort of king with a different sort of kingdom, they turn on him pretty quickly. There we go. And the cries that Jesus is king turn into crucify him in just a matter of 5 days, because he wasn't the king that they wanted. He wasn't the king they expected. In fact, the religious leaders tell him, hey, tell your followers to stop this. Stop crying out that you're the king of Israel, because this is Passover week and we have a deal with Rome. Our deal with Rome is we will keep the peace and they will let us continue to go through the motions of our religion in peace. But if you come in claiming to be king, you're going to get the whole city in an uproar. Rome's going to think that a revolution is getting ready to begin, and you're going to interrupt all of the festival and the feast that we've been looking forward to for so long. So he goes, tell them to be quiet. And he goes, I will not tell them to be quiet, because if they don't cry out, the rocks will. Why? Because he's making it one. I told you, he's not like a child that doesn't know why he's about to get in trouble. He's doing this on purpose to make sure that you understand his message is not simply, like we settle for like the real basic. Oh, they got upset with Jesus because he claimed to be God. It's like, not really. Jesus definitely is God and definitely claimed to be God, but that was not the thing that rubbed them wrong. It was this whole king thing. This whole king thing really, really upset them. More than anything else, as we're seeing, this is what he's making so clear. In verse 41 to 44, Jesus, as he continues to ride in on the donkey, he looks over the city of Jerusalem and his heart breaks for them. He says this in verse 42. He says, how I wish today you of all people would understand the way to peace, but now it's too late and peace is hidden from your eyes. Before long, your enemies will build ramparts against your walls and encircle you and enclose you on each side. They will crush you into the ground and your children with you. Your enemies will not leave a single stone in place because you did not recognize the day of God's visitation. Here's what Jesus is doing. He's pronouncing judgment over Jerusalem, over the religious leaders, and over the temple when he does this. This is a very real judgment that's coming. If you know anything about Jewish history, Josephus writes about this in his Chronicles, that from AD 66 to AD 70, Rome waged war against Jerusalem, ultimately destroying Jerusalem and its temple. And when they saw what happened to the temple, people would make the comment that they really did leave no stone on top of another. But the question becomes, once again, Jesus, here you are pronouncing judgment over this nation, over the temple. Who in the world has the right to do such a thing? The king of Israel does. The king has the right to levy judgment upon the city and upon the temple. Then the final story that we see in Luke chapter 19 that kind of continues to draw this thing to a head. Luke chapter 19, beginning in verse 45, it says, then Jesus, as he came into the town of Jerusalem, he went directly to the temple. He entered the temple and began to drive out the people selling animals for sacrifices. And he said to them, the scriptures declare, my temple will be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. After that, he taught daily in the temple, but the leading priests and teachers of religious law and other leaders of the people began planning how to kill him. So when he comes into town, he goes into the temple, which is the most sacred place for Israel. And he goes in and he stands in judgment against the whole system. He says, this place was meant to be a house of prayer. You've turned it into a den of robbers, which meant the people that were in there selling and changing money and selling these items and these animals for sacrifices, they were taking advantage of people. They were not practicing justice and mercy in the temple. And so Jesus drives them out. They're furious. And this is the thing that they finally go, we've got to figure out how to get rid of this guy. Was it because he claimed to be God? No. It was because he came into the temple, and the only one that could come into the temple and say that things need to change would have been Israel's king. And when he comes in and he starts overturning tables, he does so as Israel's king. And they finally get the message, this guy's got to go, because he's not the king that we want. He doesn't have the type of kingdom that we want to be a part of. And so we see all through the whole chapter, the message is very clear. Jesus is the king of this coming kingdom that we talked about last week. Jesus is the master of this kingdom. So what was it that got him in so much trouble? Listen, Jesus was not a threat merely because of his claims to deity. And there are those in the scriptures. I'm not denying that. But the bigger issue was his claim to royalty. And here's why. Jesus' claims to royalty were such an issue because these people, some of them knew him. They would go, whoa, wait a second. This is Mary and Joseph's boy. He ain't no king. In fact, if the stories are true, he's the one person perhaps at this time or maybe ever that could answer yes to the question, were you born in a barn? It's got like a slow burn. I'll give you a chance to catch up on that one. Like they knew. They're like, no. He came from Nazareth. Nothing good comes from Nazareth. That's not a royal city. He's not from Jerusalem. This guy's not our king. He's not even the type of king we would want. He's weak. Have you heard him talk? He actually told a whole group of people one time that if you were to get struck in the face as a king, you would think, no, you strike a king in the face, the king pulls out the sword. This guy doesn't even carry a weapon. And he told them if you were to get struck in the face, not to fight back, but to turn the other cheek. And he said really weak things like the least among you will be the greatest. So all this power and prestige that we've spent our whole lives trying to get our hands on, he says in his kingdom it's all useless. We don't want a king like that. That's a weak king. We don't want him. So the Jews didn't want him. It was offensive. They're thinking, who does he think that he is? Coming around claiming to be king. Oh, the Romans didn't care for him much either. Because if you know anything about Rome, there was only one king, and his name was Caesar. And anybody that would rise up to challenge Caesar was going to get the full weight of the Roman Empire thrown at them. See, there's no such thing as a rival king in Rome. If there was a rival king in Rome, you were going to be put down. Now, Israel had a king, Herod, and then the ones that would come after him from his family. But they were the type of king that was buddied up next to Rome that was kind of like a puppet king, not a real king. So they didn't mind that sort of king. But the type of king that Jesus was, one that would subvert the royal authorities, the ones that said, no, the way that you all are doing it is not the way that we're going to do it. The one that spoke of a far greater kingdom, a kingdom that would outlast Rome. There was no room for that. And so Israel didn't want him. The Romans didn't want him. And it all surrounded this claim that he was king. That the scriptures were about him. All this long awaited, you've been waiting on a kingdom and you've been waiting on a king. That's me. So to answer the question, Jesus knew exactly what got him in trouble. He knew exactly what was the most offensive thing that he did, to wind up on a cross. And he knew it so much because he did it on purpose. He made it unmistakable that the message is that I'm the king. I'm the king. And so here's my question to you, if that's true. See, they didn't want, the Jews didn't want him, Romans didn't want him. But do you? Like, do you want him as your king? See, this was always my issue. I've told you all this before. This was always my issue with church and Jesus and everything growing up. I didn't want a king. I wanted to do whatever I wanted to do. This is why the message of Jesus being king has to be so central to the Christian message, and it's not always that. Except for when we give like lip service, we're like, he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's like, no. Let's get down to like what it really means. It means that you're not king. If you're in this kingdom, it means the way that you spend your time, your money, the way you do relationships, the way that you do anything is no longer up to how you feel or what society says is okay. It's a complete and total bowing of your knee to another king. That's what it is. I told you last week. I think one of the reasons why we miss the message of the kingdom is because we do it intentionally, because we know what it means. We know that it robs us of our power, of our prestige, because to be in a kingdom like that means it's all about him and it's not about you, and it's not about me. And he's not taking suggestions on the way that he runs his kingdom. He doesn't have a comment card or a little box where you can submit if you like what he says or how he does things. It's just like you either just bow your knee and you take the whole thing, or stand in opposition but stand on the outside. That's our options. So he wasn't a threat merely because he claimed to be be deity. Is Jesus God? Absolutely. That was not what got him in trouble. As evidenced by the fact of this, you know, the sign that hung above him on the cross, those would be what the charges were, why this person was in trouble. Anybody remember what that sign said? King of the Jews. They didn't put, this guy thought he was God. No, they put, the reason why this guy's right here is because he claimed to be a king, and he ain't no king. We're going to show you that he's no king. This is why the Romans put a purple robe on him and a crown of thorns on his head, to mock him as king. So, have you bent your knee in submission to the king? If so, this next song you can worship. You can worship and welcome him as king the way they did whenever he rode into Jerusalem on that donkey. If not, the ones that reject him as king, the same message he had for Israel in the first century of judgment is still to this day for those that want to reject him as king. You can bow your knee in worship, or you can bow your knee in war against his kingdom and say, no, I don't want to be part of that. I'll stand in opposition to that.